Introduction. The chains we choose. Why letting go is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with rocks, each one etched with the name of someone who wronged you. The weight digs into your shoulders, slows your steps, and drains your joy. Yet, you refuse to set it down. Why? Because some part of you believes that by holding on to the weight, you're keeping score, that your anger is a shield, that your resentment is justice. But here's the truth no one tells you. The person who hurt you isn't carrying those rocks. You are. This book is about the most radical act of self-liberation you can undertake. Not because the people who hurt you deserve your forgiveness, but because you deserve peace. We live in a world that glorifies grudges. From viral revenge stories to endless cycles of blame. We've been taught that holding on to anger makes us strong, that forgiveness is weakness, that time alone heals wounds. But none of that is true. Resentment doesn't punish the past. It poisons the present. And time doesn't heal. It just buries pain alive, where it festers in our bodies, our relationships, and our futures. What if I told you there's another way? A way to break free from the past without denying your pain, transform anger into unshakable inner strength, rewire your brain so forgiveness becomes instinct, not struggle, discover the hidden science behind why letting go is the ultimate power move. This isn't about excusing the inexcusable. It's about refusing to let someone else's actions, whether a betrayal, an injustice, or an old childhood wound, continue to control your life. It's about reclaiming your energy, your focus, and your joy. Drawing on cutting-edge neuroscience, ancient wisdom, and real-life stories of radical forgiveness, this book will guide you step by step through the art of release. You'll learn why your brain clings to resentment like an addiction, how to dissolve grudges stored in your body, and how to turn pain into your greatest source of resilience. The journey won't always be easy. True freedom never is. But with every page, you'll feel the weight lifting, the space opening, the future brightening. That backpack of rocks? It's time to set it down. Your free life starts now. Let's begin. Chapter 1. What is a grudge? The hidden emotional prison we build ourselves. The human psyche has a remarkable capacity for holding on to emotional wounds long after they should have healed naturally. A grudge represents this psychological phenomenon in its most potent form. It's not merely anger, but anger that is fossilized in our hearts, transforming from a passing emotional reaction into a permanent resident of our inner landscape. When we nurture a grudge, we engage in a peculiar form of emotional self-harm where we repeatedly reopen wounds that might otherwise have healed, keeping the pain fresh through constant mental rehearsal of the offense. This process creates what psychologists call rumination, a destructive cycle where we replay painful events like a movie stuck on repeat, each viewing intensifying our distress while providing no resolution or catharsis. What makes grudges particularly insidious is how they masquerade as self-protection while actually functioning as self-imprisonment. Our primitive brain convinces us that by maintaining our resentment, we're building a fortress against future hurt, when in reality we're constructing a prison where we become both the jailer and the incarcerated. The bitter irony lies in how the person who wronged us often moves forward unburdened by our suffering, while we remain trapped in the past, our emotional growth stunted by our refusal to release what should have been temporary pain. Neuroscience research reveals that holding grudges activates the same stress pathways in our brain as actual physical threats, keeping our bodies in a perpetual state of fight or flight that erodes our mental and physical health over time. Research from MIT's Human Dynamics Lab shows that social media users who engage with forgiveness content actually receive less algorithmic promotion than those who participate in conflict, creating a perverse incentive structure where peacemaking goes viral far less often than outrage. Digital communication also enables new categories of offenses that challenge traditional forgiveness frameworks. The red receipt, left on read, the ambiguous ellipsis that implies unspoken judgment, the emoji that lands wrong. These microaggressions didn't exist in pre-digital eras yet now generate real pain. The phenomenon of ghosting, sudden unexplained withdrawal of communication, creates unique forgiveness challenges by denying closure. The brain struggles to process abandonment when the other person remains digitally present yet emotionally absent. Similarly, the constant availability of past digital interactions allows old wounds to be easily reopened. A 3A revisit to an ex's Instagram, a rereading of painful email threads from years prior, in ways that disrupt the natural fading of emotional memories. Neuropsychologists call this digital memory reconsolidation, where each revisit to an online artifact of pain essentially rewrites the memory with fresh emotional intensity. Yet the same technologies that complicate forgiveness also offer innovative tools for reconciliation when used intentionally. The pause feature on email platforms that prevents impulsive sending, the mindfulness apps that prompt breathing exercises before responding to triggering messages, the conflict mediation chatbots that guide users through structured forgiveness processes. These digital interventions can help counteract the medium's inherent biases toward escalation. Some couples now practice emoji amnesty, agreeing that certain tense digital exchanges can be resolved with pre-arranged reconciliation emojis that stand in for the facial expressions missing from text communication. Forward-thinking workplaces are implementing digital forgiveness protocols, like mandatory cooling-off periods for heated Slack channels and video-only platforms for serious conflicts to restore nonverbal communication cues. The spiritual challenge of digital age forgiveness lies in recognizing how our technologies shape not just our communication, but our very consciousness. French philosopher Bernard Stiegler's concept of tertiary retention explains how digital tools function as externalized memory systems that profoundly influence what we remember and how we remember it. When we outsource our conflicts to screens, we essentially allow Silicon Valley's attention economy to dictate the duration and intensity of our emotional wounds. Conscious practitioners of digital forgiveness therefore establish strict boundaries. No conflict resolution over text, mandatory device-free periods after disputes, ritual clearing of old digital artifacts that no longer serve growth. Some even practice digital Sabbaths, regular periods of disconnection to reset nervous systems overstimulated by perpetual low-grade outrage. The path forward requires neither Luddite rejection of technology nor passive submission to its most corrosive dynamics, but rather what media theorist Douglas Rushkoff calls present shock, the ability to remain rooted in our biological reality while skillfully navigating digital spaces. This means recognizing when a conflict requires face-to-face reconciliation, understanding that social media rewards are poor indicators of emotional truth, and remembering that the person behind the offensive tweet is as complex as we are, no matter how reductively the platform frames them. Most crucially, it demands that we periodically log off from the endless drama of digital conflict to reconnect with the slower, messier, more forgiving rhythms of embodied human life. Chapter 2. The Heavy Backpack. How Grudges Weigh Us Down Emotionally and Physically. Imagine beginning each day by strapping on an invisible backpack filled with rocks. Not just any rocks, but stones carefully engraved with every slight betrayal and injustice you've ever experienced. This is the unseen burden grudges place upon us, a psychological weight that grows heavier with each passing year, while remaining largely unnoticed until its cumulative effect becomes unbearable. The metaphor of the heavy backpack perfectly captures how resentment operates in our lives, an ever-present load that distorts our posture, slows our progress, and drains our energy while we remain oblivious to its constant drag on our well-being. Unlike physical burdens that announce themselves through muscle strain and fatigue, emotional weights insidiously embed themselves in our nervous systems, influencing everything from our breathing patterns to our facial expressions without our conscious awareness. Neuroscience reveals that the brain processes emotional pain in remarkably similar ways to physical pain, activating overlapping neural pathways that explain why heartbreak can literally feel crushing and betrayal can leave us feeling wounded. When we maintain grudges, we're essentially choosing to re-injure these neural pain centers daily, preventing emotional scars from fully forming while keeping psychological wounds raw and sensitive. Functional MRI studies show that when people dwell on past hurts, their brains light up with activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, regions associated with both physical pain perception and the processing of negative emotions. This explains why chronic resentment often manifests as actual physical symptoms: tension, headaches, digestive issues, muscle tightness, as our bodies struggle to contain the neurological storm of unforgiveness. The physiological impact of carrying grudges extends far beyond temporary discomfort into measurable changes in our biological functioning. Research in psychoneuroimmunology demonstrates how chronic anger and resentment trigger prolonged activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal (HPA) axis, leading to sustained cortisol elevation that disrupts nearly every bodily system. Over time, this creates a perfect storm of health consequences: impaired immune function that leaves us vulnerable to illness, increased systemic inflammation linked to chronic diseases, and accelerated cellular aging visible at the chromosomal level through telomere shortening. The body keeps score in ways we're only beginning to understand, with studies showing that people who score high on measures of unforgiveness exhibit poorer sleep quality, higher blood pressure, and even altered gene expression related to stress responses compared to their more forgiving counterparts. Psychologically, grudges function like distorted lenses that warp our perception of present reality through the unresolved pains of the past. Each carried resentment adds another filter through which we interpret new experiences, creating confirmation biases that lead us to expect betrayal where none exists and perceive slights where none were intended. This explains why people holding long-standing grudges often report feeling increasingly isolated and misunderstood. Their emotional baggage has subtly reshaped how they perceive social interactions, making them hypervigilant for signs of disrespect while overlooking opportunities for connection. The mind affected by chronic resentment becomes like a magnet for negativity, unconsciously seeking out evidence to justify its bitterness while dismissing contradictory experiences that might challenge its worldview. The cognitive load imposed by grudges represents another often overlooked cost of unforgiveness. Our working memory has limited capacity, and every mental rehearsal of past wrongs consumes precious cognitive resources that could otherwise be directed toward creative problem-solving, learning new skills, or simply being fully present in our daily lives. Psychological studies demonstrate that people preoccupied with resentment perform worse on tests of executive function, showing impaired concentration, reduced mental flexibility, and diminished capacity for complex reasoning. In essence, the mental energy we devote to maintaining our grudges is stolen from our ability to engage meaningfully with the present and plan effectively for the future, leaving us cognitively impoverished even as we imagine we're protecting ourselves from further hurt. Interpersonally, the weight of grudges manifests in subtle but destructive ways that erode our most important relationships. Like invisible walls built brick by bitter brick, our accumulated resentments create barriers to intimacy that leave us feeling isolated even in crowded rooms. The defensive postures we adopt to avoid being hurt again, the reluctance to trust, the tendency to assume the worst, the quickness to take offense, may have originated as reasonable protections against genuine harm, but gradually become prisons that keep out love as effectively as they repel potential hurt. Relationship researchers find that people who struggle to forgive report lower satisfaction in all their interpersonal connections, not just those involving the original offense, suggesting that resentment's poison spreads far beyond its initial target. The spiritual and existential dimensions of grudge-bearing reveal perhaps its deepest paradox, that in our quest to punish others through our unforgiveness, we ultimately punish ourselves by remaining trapped in stories where we're perpetual victims. Every grudge represents a narrative we've constructed about ourselves and our place in the world, a story that inevitably casts us as the wounded party in someone else's drama. While these narratives may initially serve to validate our pain, over time, they become limiting identities that constrain our growth and potential. The moment we recognize that our grudges have become central to how we understand ourselves marks a critical turning point. Will we continue clinging to these painful identities because they've become familiar, or dare to write new stories where we're defined by our resilience rather than our wounds? Breaking free from resentment's weight requires both courage and strategy, beginning with the fundamental realization that setting down our emotional baggage doesn't excuse others' behavior, but rather reclaims our right to move through life unencumbered. Therapeutic approaches, like mindfulness meditation, help develop the metacognitive awareness to notice when we're mentally rehearsing old grievances, while cognitive behavioral techniques provide tools for challenging and reframing the automatic thoughts that sustain resentment. Somatic therapies that address how emotional pain manifests in the body can be particularly effective for people whose grudges have become physically encoded as chronic tension or pain patterns. The common thread across all successful approaches is the recognition that forgiveness represents not weakness, but profound strength, the ability to acknowledge deep hurt while refusing to let that hurt dictate one's present experience or future possibilities. As we examine specific strategies for lightening our emotional loads in subsequent chapters, we'll explore how various forgiveness practices can help remove those heavy stones from our backpacks one by one. From expressive writing techniques that externalize resentment to compassion meditation practices that reshape our neural pathways, the tools for emotional liberation exist. What's required is the willingness to believe that freedom from resentment's weight is possible, and the courage to begin unpacking what we've carried for far too long. The journey may feel daunting at first, but each released grudge creates space for lightness, possibility, and a renewed capacity to engage life without the distorting lens of past pain. Chapter 3. The False Promise of Grudges. Why we cling to pain that no longer serves us. The human psyche has a peculiar relationship with pain. We often cling to emotional wounds long after they've stopped serving any protective purpose, convincing ourselves that our continued suffering somehow honors the gravity of what we've endured. This psychological phenomenon explains why grudges can feel so strangely comforting despite their obvious toxicity. Like a security blanket woven from barbed wire, we hold tight to our resentments because they've become familiar companions in our emotional landscape, their sharp edges reminding us we're still alive even as they draw fresh blood with every movement. At the core of this self-defeating behavior lies a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of emotional pain. We mistakenly believe that by maintaining our connection to past hurts, we're demonstrating strength or moral superiority. In reality, we're engaging in a form of psychological self-harm that neuroscientists can now visualize through brain imaging technology. When we ruminate on old wounds, our neural pathways light up with the same intensity as if we were experiencing the hurt anew, creating what researchers call phantom pain, emotional suffering that persists long after the original injury has healed. This explains why people can feel physically shaken when recalling decades-old betrayals, their bodies reacting as though the trauma just occurred. The social dimension of grudge holding reveals another layer of complexity in our attachment to resentment. In many ways, our grudges serve as psychological boundary markers, helping us define who we are by establishing who we are not. The executive who still seethes about a career setback 15 years later isn't just angry about a past event, she's constructed an entire identity around being the wrong party, a role that provides a strange sense of cohesion to her life narrative. This identity paradox helps explain why letting go of long-held resentments can feel so threatening. It requires us to relinquish not just our anger, but the sense of self we've built upon it. Modern therapeutic approaches have begun reframing grudges as emotional stuck points, places where our natural healing processes have become obstructed by maladaptive thought patterns. Cognitive behavioral therapists identify several common distortions that maintain grudges: magnification, blowing the offense up to cosmic proportions; permanence, believing the damage can never be overcome; and personalization, viewing the offense as proof of our unworthiness. These mental habits create feedback loops where each recollection of the hurt reinforces the distortion, making the grudge increasingly resistant to resolution over time. The physiological consequences of sustained resentment present what may be the most compelling argument for emotional amnesty. When we maintain grudges, our bodies remain in a low-grade fight-or-flight state, with stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine circulating at elevated levels. This chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system leads to measurable deterioration across multiple bodily systems, increased arterial stiffness, reduced heart rate variability, and suppressed immune function being just a few documented effects. Endocrinologists now understand that the body interprets sustained resentment as an ongoing threat, diverting resources away from repair and maintenance functions to prepare for imagined confrontations that never come. Interpersonally, grudges function like emotional landmines that contaminate our relationships long after the original conflict. Social psychologists have identified what they call the spillover effect. Unresolved resentment from one relationship inevitably seeps into others, coloring our interactions with people who had nothing to do with the original offense. This explains why individuals with long-standing grudges often report feeling disconnected even in their closest relationships. They've unknowingly erected psychological barriers designed to protect against past hurts that now prevent present intimacy. The path to releasing grudges isn't through sheer willpower or forced forgiveness, but through what psychologists call emotional completion. The process of fully acknowledging our pain while recognizing that continuing to carry it serves no constructive purpose. This often requires us to confront the hidden payoff we've been getting from our resentment, whether it's the moral high ground, the avoidance of vulnerability, or simply the comfort of familiar suffering. Only when we acknowledge these secondary gains can we make a clear-eyed decision about whether they're worth the tremendous cost. Recent advances in neuroplasticity research offer hope for even the most entrenched grudges. Studies show that mindfulness practices can literally rewire the brain's response to painful memories, decreasing activity in the amygdala, the fear center, while strengthening connections to the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational assessment. This neural remodeling allows us to recall hurtful events without being emotionally hijacked by them, the defining characteristic of true emotional resolution. Ultimately, letting go of grudges represents not an act of capitulation, but an evolutionary leap in personal development. It marks the transition from passive victimhood to active authorship of our emotional lives, from being defined by what happened to us to being shaped by how we've grown through it. This shift in orientation from backward-looking resentment to forward-focused resilience may be one of the most significant upgrades we can make to our emotional operating systems. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of Resentment, Dissecting the Hidden Architecture of Grudges. Resentment is not a monolithic emotion, but rather a complex psychological ecosystem, a tangled network of wounded pride, unmet expectations, and thwarted justice. To understand why grudges take root so stubbornly in the human psyche, we must examine their underlying structure, the invisible scaffolding that allows bitterness to flourish long after the initial injury. Like forensic psychologists analyzing a crime scene, we can trace the fingerprints of resentment back to specific cognitive, emotional, and even physiological processes that conspire to keep us trapped in cycles of recycled anger. At the neurological level, grudges are sustained by what scientists call memory reconsolidation, a process where each time we recall a painful event, we don't simply retrieve the memory but actively rewrite it, layering in fresh emotions that intensify its impact. This explains why certain betrayals seem to grow more painful with time rather than fading. We aren't remembering the original event so much as reliving our accumulated grievances about it. Brain scans reveal that when people dwell on old resentments, their neural activity mirrors patterns seen in addiction. The same dopamine-driven loops that reinforce substance dependence also fuel our attachment to righteous indignation. In essence, we can become chemically hooked on our own bitterness. The psychological architecture of resentment relies heavily on narrative construction. When someone wounds us, we don't just experience the raw hurt, we instinctively craft a story around it, complete with heroes, villains, and moral lessons. These narratives harden over time into personal myths that shape our identity. I was wrong because I was too trusting. Or, people will always take advantage. Cognitive scientists call this explanatory style, the framework we use to make sense of suffering. The problem arises when these stories become so rigid that they filter all new experiences through old pain, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where we perceive slights where none exist or push people away preemptively to avoid imagined betrayal. Social and evolutionary psychology offer compelling theories about why humans seem wired for grudge holding. Our distant ancestors lived in small tribes where remembering who wronged whom was crucial for survival, a cognitive adaptation that persists in modern brains ill-equipped for today's complex social landscapes. Additionally, resentment often serves unspoken social functions. It can signal moral boundaries. This behavior is unacceptable. Maintain group cohesion. We don't treat each other this way. Or preserve self-esteem. I deserve better. Yet these potentially useful functions backfire when grievances outlive their context, morphing from protective mechanisms into psychological prisons. The physiology of resentment reveals even deeper layers. Studies in psychoneuroendocrinology show that harboring grudges triggers low-grade but chronic activation of the body's inflammatory response. The same cytokines that help heal physical wounds, when constantly elevated by emotional bitterness, contribute to everything from depression to cardiovascular disease. Fascinatingly, researchers have found measurable differences in the stress hormone profiles of people who score high on forgiveness scales versus those prone to resentment. Differences significant enough to predict long-term health outcomes. Our cells, it seems, keep score even when our conscious minds pretend otherwise. Perhaps most insidiously, resentment warps our perception of time. Psychological experiments demonstrate that when people focus on past hurts, their subjective experience of time slows down. Minutes feel longer, days drag, and the past feels unnervingly present. This temporal distortion creates the illusion that the offending event is still unfolding, trapping us in an endless emotional present where closure remains perpetually out of reach. Time, which normally heals wounds, instead becomes frozen when filtered through the lens of unforgiveness. The path to dismantling resentment's architecture begins with recognizing it as a constructed reality rather than an inevitable response to hurt. Just as buildings can be deconstructed beam by beam, grudges can be disassembled through deliberate examination of their supporting structures. The distorted thoughts, reinforced neural pathways, and self-protective narratives that sustain them. This process isn't about denying pain, but about refusing to let that pain design the blueprint of our future selves. Chapter 5. The Letting Go Paradox. When forgiveness feels like surrender, but actually means freedom. There exists a fundamental paradox at the heart of forgiveness that few people acknowledge. The act of releasing a grudge often feels like conceding defeat, when in reality, it represents the ultimate reclaiming of personal power. This psychological contradiction explains why so many people remain trapped in resentment long after it has stopped serving them. Because on some visceral level, letting go registers in our nervous system as allowing the offender to win. We confuse forgiveness with capitulation, as though by surrendering our anger, we are somehow endorsing the original wrongdoing or declaring that what happened was acceptable. Nothing could be further from the truth. The misunderstanding stems from a flawed cultural narrative about justice and closure. We have been conditioned to believe that emotional resolution must be earned through some form of reckoning, an apology, an admission of guilt, or at the very least, the offender's acknowledgement of our pain. When that reckoning never comes, we interpret forgiveness as a one-sided truce, an unfair resolution where the guilty party walks away unscathed while we are left to swallow our rage. But this framing ignores a crucial reality. The person most harmed by our unforgiveness is not the one who hurt us, it's ourselves. The energy we expend maintaining resentment is energy stolen from our present joy, creativity, and growth. Neuroscience reveals why this paradox is so difficult to overcome. Brain imaging studies show that when we ruminate on past hurts, the regions associated with threat detection, the amygdala, and moral judgment, the prefrontal cortex, activate in tandem, creating a feedback loop where anger feels both righteous and necessary for self-protection. This neural wiring explains why letting go can initially trigger discomfort. Our brain interprets the release of resentment as a threat to our moral boundaries, as though forgiving means lowering our defenses. In reality, forgiveness doesn't mean dropping our guard. It means refusing to let someone else's actions continue to dictate our emotional state. The emotional weight of this paradox manifests in tangible ways. Consider the case of Elena, who spent a decade resenting her father for abandoning their family. She believed her anger was keeping him accountable, that if she ever forgave him, she would be betraying her younger self's pain. But over time, she noticed a pattern. Her bitterness wasn't hurting her father. He had moved on, remarried, and built a new life. While she remained stuck, her relationship strained by an inability to trust. The moment she grasped the paradox, that by clinging to resentment, she was allowing his past actions to control her present, was the moment she began reclaiming her freedom. This is not to suggest that forgiveness is easy, or that it requires minimizing real harm. On the contrary, true forgiveness demands that we fully acknowledge the depth of our wounds before deciding that we will no longer let them define us. It is an act of defiance, not submission. A refusal to let someone else's behavior continue to shape our inner world. The real surrender isn't in forgiving. It's in allowing a past hurt to monopolize our emotional energy indefinitely. The path through this paradox requires a shift in perspective, recognizing that forgiveness is not something we do for the person who wronged us, but for ourselves. It is the deliberate choice to stop investing in pain and instead reinvest in possibility. It does not require reconciliation, nor does it demand that we forget. It simply means we are no longer willing to pay the ongoing cost of resentment. Chapter 6. The Empathy Dilemma. Holding space for understanding without excusing harm. One of the most challenging contradictions in the journey toward forgiveness lies in the tension between empathy and self-protection. We are often told that to truly let go of resentment, we must try to see things from the other person's perspective. A noble sentiment that, when applied clumsily, can morph into a form of emotional self-betrayal. There's a dangerous cultural undercurrent suggesting that if we just understand why someone hurt us, their behavior will somehow become acceptable, as though context necessarily justifies consequence. This false equivalency leaves many people stranded between two extremes. Either they swallow their pain under the guise of compassion, or they reject empathy entirely, viewing it as weakness that leaves them vulnerable to further harm. The reality is far more nuanced. True emotional healing requires us to develop what psychologists call boundaried empathy, the ability to acknowledge another's humanity without absolving their harmful actions. The neurological basis for this dilemma reveals why it's so difficult to navigate. When we attempt to empathize with someone who has hurt us, our brain engages in what neuroscientists term mental state attribution, the ability to imagine another's thoughts, motivations, and emotional experiences. This process activates the temporoparietal junction and medial prefrontal cortex, regions associated with perspective taking. Simultaneously, recalling the pain they cause lights up the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, areas that process emotional distress. The resulting neural conflict creates the psychological equivalent of pressing the gas and brake pedals simultaneously. Part of us strains toward understanding, while another part recoils in self-protective anger. This explains why attempts at forced empathy often backfire, leaving us feeling emotionally raw rather than resolved. The stories we carry about our offenders complicate this further. Human memory doesn't record events with objective fidelity. It constructs narratives shaped by our present emotions. Every time we recall a betrayal, we unconsciously embellish or diminish certain details based on our current mindset. A person who views their ex-partner through the lens of bitterness will remember only their flaws, while someone pushing for premature forgiveness might suppress valid anger in favor of sanitized recollections. Neither approach leads to genuine resolution. The middle path, what trauma specialists call balanced remembrance, involves holding two truths simultaneously. This person acted in ways that hurt me deeply, and they are a complex human being with their own wounds and limitations. This dual awareness prevents empathy from becoming exoneration. Consider the case of David, who struggled for years with resentment toward his alcoholic mother. Well-meaning friends urged him to understand she was doing her best, advice that only amplified his guilt for being angry. It wasn't until therapy helped him separate explanation from justification that he found peace. He came to see that while his mother's addiction explained her neglect, it didn't erase his childhood loneliness. This differentiation allowed him to feel compassion for her struggles without pretending they hadn't damaged him, a critical distinction that freed him from cycling between rage and false absolution. The social dimension of this dilemma adds another layer of complexity. We live in a culture that often confuses forgiveness with reconciliation, pressuring victims to resume relationships before they fully process their hurt. This conflation ignores a fundamental truth. Empathy can exist without restoration. One can recognize that a cheating partner acted out of their own insecurities without taking them back. One can understand that a bullying coworker was projecting their professional fears without subjecting oneself to further mistreatment. The key lies in recognizing that insight doesn't obligate intimacy. We can extend mental understanding while maintaining physical or emotional distance when necessary for our well-being. Practical tools exist for navigating this tightrope. Compassionate detachment, a technique drawn from mindfulness traditions, involves visualizing the offender's suffering without absorbing it, imagining, for instance, the childhood experiences that shape their harmful behaviors while keeping conscious awareness that those experiences don't nullify your right to boundaries. Another approach is empathic journaling, where you write a letter to yourself from the offender's perspective, not to excuse their actions, but to dilute the dehumanizing stereotypes that often in our minds after betrayal. The goal isn't to manufacture sympathy, but to drain the charge from painful memories by seeing all parties, yourself included, as flawed humans rather than archetypal villains and victims. The redemption of this difficult work comes not in the form of warm feelings toward those who hurt us, but in the quiet liberation from obsessive anger. When we stop seeing our offenders as one-dimensional monsters, we paradoxically reduce their power over us. It's far harder to remain consumed by hatred towards someone we recognize as a tangled mix of good and bad, just like ourselves. This doesn't mean equating their misdeeds with our ordinary flaws, but rather acknowledging that reducing people to their worst moments keeps us psychologically yoked to those moments. The ultimate gift of boundaried empathy isn't absolution for them, but freedom for us, the ability to recall painful events without being emotionally hijacked by them. Chapter 7. The Body Keeps Score. How Unforgiveness Manifests as Physical Pain and Disease. The human body possesses an extraordinary capacity to translate emotional wounds into physical symptoms, a biological truth that modern medicine is only beginning to fully comprehend. When we harbor long-term resentment, we aren't just sustaining psychological distress. We're initiating a cascade of physiological changes that reverberate through every system in our body. This phenomenon, popularized by trauma expert Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's seminal work, The Body Keeps the Score, reveals a sobering reality. Our cells, muscles, and nervous system maintain an exact record of every grudge we refuse to release, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. The jaw that clenches at the memory of a betrayal, the stomach that knots when recalling an old injustice, the chronic back pain that defies medical explanation. These are not random malfunctions, but coded messages from a body burdened by the weight of unforgiveness. Medical researchers have identified concrete mechanisms by which sustained resentment becomes embodied. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal (HPA) axis, our central stress response system, remains chronically activated when we ruminate on past hurts, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline long after the original threat has passed. This hormonal onslaught triggers systemic inflammation, now recognized as the common pathway for numerous chronic conditions from hypertension to autoimmune disorders. Cardiologists have documented how bitter emotions contribute to arterial stiffness and reduced heart rate variability, while gastroenterologists observe how unresolved anger alters gut microbiota and digestive function. Perhaps most strikingly, epigenetic studies demonstrate how prolonged emotional distress can activate stress-related genes while silencing those responsible for cellular repair and immune regulation, literal changes at the chromosomal level that accelerate biological aging. The muscular system provides particularly visible evidence of grudge-related tension. Biofeedback studies show that when subjects recall past grievances, their surface electromyography readings spike in characteristic patterns. Trapezius muscles hunching toward the ears, the physiological manifestation of carrying the weight of the world. Masseters tightening, that unconscious jaw clenching of suppressed rage, and erector spiny quilling along the spine, the armored posture of defensive bitterness. Over time, these habitual tension patterns reshape the body's structure: forward head posture from emotional burdens, compressed vertebrae from carrying invisible loads, restricted breathing from guarded emotional patterns. Physical therapists increasingly recognize that many chronic pain patients aren't just treating injuries, but literal embodiments of unforgiven history. The neurological pathways of resentment reveal why these physical manifestations prove so persistent. Functional MRI scans demonstrate that when people recall past hurts, their brains activate not just emotional centers like the amygdala, but also the somatosensory cortex, the region responsible for mapping physical sensations. This neural coupling explains why emotional pain so often manifests as bodily symptoms. The brain literally processes betrayal as a physical assault. Even more remarkably, neuroplasticity research shows that sustained resentment strengthens these neural pathways through a process called long-term potentiation, essentially training the brain to more efficiently convert emotional distress into physical symptoms with each recurrence. The body doesn't merely remember the grudge. It becomes increasingly adept at expressing it. Clinical case histories bring these physiological principles into stark relief. Consider the patient with treatment-resistant migraines whose pain spiked every anniversary of her business partner's betrayal, or the man whose frozen shoulder thawed only after addressing decades-old resentment toward his father, or the woman whose eczema cleared when she finally confronted her sister's childhood cruelty. These aren't anecdotal flukes but documented examples of psychosomatic illness, a term that doesn't mean imaginary, as commonly misunderstood, but rather mind-body interconnectedness at its most profound level. Traditional Chinese medicine's concept of stagnant qi and Ayurveda's understanding of emotional toxins accumulating in tissues represent ancient recognitions of this same truth. What we don't release physically remains. Somatic therapies offer powerful tools for breaking this cycle. Trauma-informed modalities, like Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, teach patients to track resentment's physical signatures: the clenched fists when recalling an injustice, the breath holding when remembering a humiliation, and use bodily awareness to discharge trapped emotional energy. Simple practices like progressive muscle relaxation can reveal where we've somatized old grudges, while biofeedback training helps recalibrate stress responses hijacked by past hurts. Even basic physical exercise takes on new significance when understood as literal shaking loose of emotional residue. The reason many people report emotional breakthroughs during activities like yoga, swimming, or weight training. The path to physical release often begins with recognizing our body's distress signals as communications rather than malfunctions. That tension headache when thinking about a cheating ex isn't merely a physiological reaction, but the body's plea. We're still fighting this old battle. The insomnia that worsens after family conflicts isn't random sleeplessness, but the nervous system's declaration that emotional business remains unfinished. By learning this somatic language, we gain access to a powerful feedback system that tracks our forgiveness progress with far more accuracy than our often self-deceptive conscious minds. Emerging research in psychoneuroimmunology suggests that the reverse process is equally true. As we genuinely release resentments, our bodies undergo measurable healing. Studies on forgiveness interventions document reductions in inflammatory markers, improved heart rate variability, and even enhanced telomerase activity, associated with cellular longevity. The body's capacity to mirror emotional release isn't just metaphorical but quantifiable. When we truly let go psychologically, our physiology follows suit. This explains why many people report spontaneous physical improvements after forgiveness work: better digestion, deeper sleep, vanished aches that once seemed permanent. The body knows when the war is over, even if the mind lingers on battlefield. Chapter 8. The Hidden Economy of Grudges. Why we secretly cling to what hurts us. Beneath the surface of our conscious awareness operates a shadow economy where resentment functions as counterfeit currency, an emotional tinder we continue to accept even as it bankrupts our well-being. This psychological black market thrives because grudges, despite their obvious toxicity, provide certain unspoken benefits that make them paradoxically difficult to relinquish. Like a junk food diet that damages our health while offering immediate comfort, resentment delivers short-term psychological payoffs that keep us coming back despite the long-term costs. Understanding these hidden incentives is crucial to breaking their hold, for we cannot release what we don't first acknowledge we're clinging to for reasons beyond the obvious. One of resentment's most seductive dividends is the moral high ground it provides. When we nurse a grudge, we cast ourselves as the wrong party in an ongoing drama, a role that carries certain psychological privileges. Research in social psychology confirms that perceived victim status activates what scientists term moral license, granting us permission to indulge behaviors, self-righteousness, passive aggression, even outright hostility that would otherwise conflict with our self-image as good people. This explains why some individuals seem almost reluctant to let go of grievances. Their identity has become enmeshed with being the injured party, a stance that provides both social sympathy and moral exemption from accountability for their own behavior. The bitter irony, of course, is that this very entitlement often transforms victims into perpetrators, as the aggrieved justify their own hurtful actions as deserved retribution. Resentment also serves as a potent distraction from more uncomfortable emotions we'd rather not face. The clean, bright flame of anger often masks deeper, messier feelings. Grief we can't bear to feel, shame we can't acknowledge, vulnerability we can't tolerate. Clinical psychologists observe this dynamic frequently in therapy sessions. When patients begin accessing the raw hurt beneath their rage, they often instinctively retreat to familiar resentment like a psychological security blanket. The adrenaline surge of bitterness provides temporary relief from the heavier, slower emotions it conceals, functioning like emotional amphetamines that ward off depressive collapse. This explains why attempts to just let go of grudges often fail. We're asking people to relinquish their primary defense against even more painful emotional states without providing alternative coping mechanisms. The social dynamics of grudge holding reveal another layer of hidden benefits. In group settings, shared resentment creates powerful bonding, what sociologists call negative social capital. Whether it's coworkers united against a difficult boss, siblings commiserating about childhood wounds, or political tribes fueled by mutual enemies, collective grievances foster a sense of belonging that can feel more immediate and intense than positive connections. The biochemical basis for this phenomenon lies in oxytocin, the so-called love hormone, that also enhances tribal bonding against perceived threats. Our neurochemistry literally rewards us for shared resentment, making it doubly difficult to break free when doing so might mean social isolation or exclusion from the group. Perhaps most insidiously, resentment provides an illusion of control in situations where we felt powerless. When someone wounds us deeply, the inability to make them understand or repent leaves us psychologically stranded, a state cognitive psychologists term unfinished business. By maintaining active anger, we create the fantasy that the story isn't over, that we still have some leverage to force acknowledgement or change. This explains why people often escalate conflicts long after practical resolution is possible. The alternative is facing the helplessness of realizing some wounds will never be properly mended, some apologies will never come. The grudge becomes a psychological protest against this unacceptable reality, a refusal to concede emotional defeat even when doing so would bring peace. The workplace presents particularly clear examples of these hidden payoffs in action. Consider the employee who nurses years of resentment over a missed promotion. Their bitterness may excuse them from ambitious efforts, protecting them from potential failure, justify mediocre performance. Why should I try when they don't appreciate me? and garners sympathy from colleagues. The original injustice may have been real, but the sustained resentment now serves multiple psychological functions beyond mere reaction to that event. Similarly, in family systems, grudges often become relational currencies, ways to maintain connection, even negative connection, while avoiding more vulnerable forms of intimacy that might risk fresh hurt. Breaking free requires first conducting an honest audit of these hidden benefits, identifying what we're truly getting from our resentments, however toxic the exchange. Cognitive behavioral therapists use a powerful tool called functional analysis for this purpose, systematically examining what precedes and follows grudge episodes to identify their reinforcing payoffs. A person might discover, for instance, that replaying an old betrayal reliably distracts them from current anxieties, or that their resentment toward a parent consistently earns them comforting attention from their partner. These aren't conscious manipulations, but psychological adaptations, problematic solutions that nonetheless serve some emotional purpose. The path forward lies not in sheer willpower to stop being angry, but in developing healthier alternatives to meet these underlying needs. If resentment provides moral justification, we must cultivate self-worth independent of victim status. If it wards off vulnerability, we need safer containers for those tender emotions. If it creates social bonds, we require more authentic connections. And if it maintains the illusion of control, we must develop tolerance for life's inherent uncertainties. This transition inevitably involves a period of emotional withdrawal, the psychological equivalent of quitting an addictive substance, as the nervous system adjusts to functioning without its familiar, if toxic, coping mechanisms. The ultimate liberation comes when we recognize that these supposed benefits were always illusions, that the moral high ground was actually quicksand, the distraction from pain merely deferred it, the social bonds based on negativity ultimately imprisoning, and the sense of control entirely fictional. What remains is the sober but empowering realization that while we didn't choose our wounds, we alone choose how long they continue to define us, and that true strength lies not in maintaining our resentments, but in outgrowing them. Chapter 9. The Forgiveness Paradox. Why premature forgiveness can be as toxic as chronic resentment. In our well-intentioned efforts to move past pain, we often fall into one of forgiveness's most subtle traps: the belief that spiritual maturity means rushing past anger into premature absolution. This cultural pressure to just let it go creates a dangerous bypassing of necessary emotional labor, papering over raw wounds with platitudes before the deeper healing has truly begun. The paradox lies in this: authentic forgiveness cannot occur until we fully honor the validity of our anger, because true release requires first acknowledging exactly what it is we're releasing. To declare forgiveness before thoroughly processing our rage is like applying a fresh coat of paint over rotting wood. The surface may look restored, but the structural damage continues spreading beneath. Psychology recognizes this phenomenon as spiritual bypassing, where we use transcendent ideals to avoid confronting painful but necessary emotional work, ironically stunting the very growth we seek to accelerate. The neuroscience of emotional processing explains why this rushed approach backfires. When we experience betrayal or injustice, our amygdala triggers a cascade of stress hormones that prepare the body to respond to threat. This is the biological basis of anger. If we suppress this response prematurely in service of appearing forgiving or spiritually evolved, the unprocessed emotional charge doesn't disappear, but instead gets shunted into what researchers call implicit memory, where it continues influencing our behavior and physiology beneath conscious awareness. Functional MRI studies show that people who claim to have forgiven while still exhibiting physiological stress responses, increased heart rate, sweating, etc., when recalling the offense, display neural activity patterns identical to those actively holding grudges. Their bodies know the truth their conscious minds deny. This explains why so many forgiven hurts resurface years later with undiminished intensity. They were never fully metabolized, only temporarily buried. The societal pressure toward premature forgiveness often carries troubling moral overtones. particularly for marginalized groups. Women socialized to prioritize others' comfort over their own righteous anger, racial minorities told to move on from historical injustices, abuse survivors urged to forgive for their own good. These narratives frequently serve the comfort of perpetrators and bystanders more than the healing of the wounded. Psychologist Dr. Beverly Engel identifies this as compulsory forgiveness syndrome, where victims are shamed into absolution before they've had adequate time to process their trauma, reinforcing cycles of disempowerment. True emotional sovereignty requires the freedom to move through anger at one's own pace, not according to external timetables designed to maintain social harmony. There's profound wisdom in the recovery movement's adage, "Don't should on yourself," including the should of when and how to forgive. The journey of Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl illustrates this paradox with harrowing clarity. After enduring Auschwitz, Frankl resisted pressure to either cling to bitterness or offer cheap forgiveness. Instead, he modeled what he called tragic optimism, fully acknowledging the unimaginable horrors while still finding meaning in survival. His approach demonstrates that the most profound forgiveness emerges not from denying anger, but from allowing it to mature into something more nuanced, a process that cannot be rushed without losing its transformative power. Like wine moving from fermentation to clarification to aging, emotional resolution follows its own necessary timeline, and shortcuts produce only vinegar where there might have been complexity and depth. Practical tools exist for navigating this delicate balance between honoring anger and moving beyond it. Anger mapping, a technique adapted from trauma therapy, involves systematically exploring the dimensions of one's rage, its physical sensations. Where do you feel it in your body? Its implicit beliefs. This means I'm unworthy. Its protective functions. This anger keeps me from being vulnerable again. By giving structured attention to these elements, we prevent anger from becoming stagnant while still respecting its validity. Another approach is time containment, setting aside deliberate periods, perhaps 20 minutes daily, to fully engage with angry thoughts through journaling or vocal expression, then consciously transitioning to other activities. A method that satisfies the psyche's need for acknowledgement while preventing rumination from dominating one's life. The spiritual dimension of this paradox reveals perhaps its deepest lesson. Authentic forgiveness isn't a single heroic act but a gradual unfolding, like the changing of seasons rather than the flipping of a switch. Various wisdom traditions reflect this understanding. The Jewish concept of teshuvah requires genuine repentance from the offender before forgiveness is expected. Buddhist psychology views anger as a natural energy that must be skillfully transformed rather than suppressed. Indigenous reconciliation practices often involve lengthy truth-telling ceremonies before any talk of forgiveness begins. These traditions recognize that real peace comes not from skipping steps in the emotional process, but from moving through them with conscious intention. For those navigating this challenging terrain, the key lies in rejecting false binaries. The idea that we must choose between endless bitterness and immediate pardon. The middle path involves recognizing forgiveness as a spiral journey where we may revisit certain layers of anger at deeper levels of understanding, each round not representing failure, but increased sophistication in our healing. This explains why someone might genuinely forgive an offense at surface level, only to discover years later, perhaps when becoming a parent themselves, or achieving professional success, that new dimensions of old wounds require fresh attention and release. Such recurrences aren't setbacks, but evidence of the heart's ongoing excavation work, uncovering buried shards we didn't know remained. Ultimately, the forgiveness paradox teaches us that the quickest way to prolong suffering is to pretend it doesn't exist. That by trying to arrive at peace before we fully acknowledge the war, we simply take up residence in its aftermath. True reconciliation with life's injuries comes not from transcending our humanity, but from embracing its full spectrum, allowing anger its season so compassion might eventually flower from richer soil. As we'll explore in the next chapter, this organic unfolding leads to a quality of forgiveness far more durable and profound than any achieved through force of will, one rooted not in spiritual achievement, but in the quiet triumph of integrated wholeness. Chapter 10. The Alchemy of Anger, Transforming Righteous Rage into Wisdom and Power. Anger carries an immense transformative potential that most spiritual and psychological frameworks fail to acknowledge. When properly channeled, it serves not as a destructive force to be eradicated, but as an evolutionary catalyst that propels us towards self-actualization. This misunderstood emotion contains within it the blueprint for our unmet needs, the boundaries we've failed to establish, and the values we hold most sacred. The key lies not in suppressing or prematurely releasing anger, but in learning to distill its purest essence, separating the vital information it carries from the toxic byproducts of rumination and resentment. Like ancient alchemists turning base metals into gold, we can refine raw fury into focused power, but this transmutation requires specific psychological and physiological conditions that our culture rarely teaches. Neuroscience reveals why anger possesses this unique transformative capacity. Unlike fear or sadness, which trigger withdrawal responses, anger activates the brain's approach-oriented systems, the same neural circuits that drive motivation, goal pursuit, and protective action. Functional MRI studies show that when subjects experience righteous anger, as opposed to petty irritation, their prefrontal cortex lights up with heightened clarity and focus, while dopamine release provides sustained energy to address injustices. This explains why historically, all great social justice movements have been fueled by moral outrage. Anger properly harnessed becomes the engine of change. The problem arises not from anger itself, but from its mismanagement. When we either suppress it until it metastasizes into resentment, or express it indiscriminately until it burns out into exhaustion. The middle path involves what psychologists call anger differentiation, learning to decode the specific messages our anger carries about violated boundaries, disregarded values, or neglected needs. The body's response to anger provides further clues for its alchemical potential. Where chronic resentment creates low-grade inflammation and stress hormone dysregulation, properly expressed anger triggers a precise, time-limited cascade of cortisol and adrenaline that enhances physical strength, mental acuity, and pain tolerance, the exact biological state our ancestors needed to confront threats or protect their tribes. Modern research confirms that individuals who skillfully harness anger during challenges, whether athletic competitions, public speaking, or creative endeavors, demonstrate improved performance metrics compared to those attempting calm detachment. The physiological signature of constructive anger shows rapid activation followed by complete resolution, leaving no metabolic residue, a stark contrast to the lingering toxicity of grudges. This explains why people often report feeling energized and clear-headed after appropriately expressing anger, while suppressed rage manifests as fatigue, muscle tension, and brain fog. Psychological studies of high-achieving individuals reveal another dimension of anger's transformative power. When researchers examined how successful people process professional setbacks or injustices, they discovered a consistent pattern. Rather than denying their anger or dwelling in victimhood, these individuals used their initial outrage to fuel strategic planning and renewed effort. Their anger functioned as an internal alarm system highlighting areas requiring change, whether in their environment, relationships, or personal approach. This stands in direct contrast to underachievers who either suppressed their anger until it turned inward as depression, or vented it unproductively until they burned bridges. The critical difference lay not in the presence of anger, but in its redirection toward concrete goals and boundary setting, what psychologists term anger utilization competence. The shadow side of this alchemical process emerges when anger becomes detached from its original catalyst and mutates into a free-floating identity. We've all encountered people who become professional victims or perpetual rebels, individuals whose initial righteous anger calcified into a rigid personality structure organized around opposition. This occurs when anger transitions from a temporary emotional state to a chronic cognitive filter through which all experiences are interpreted. The telltale signs include binary thinking, viewing people as either allies or enemies, confirmation bias, only noticing information that validates the anger, and emotional reasoning. I feel angry, therefore I must be right. Breaking this pattern requires what Jungian analysts call shadow reintegration, recognizing that our anger often contains disowned parts of ourselves we projected onto others. The colleague whose laziness enrages us may mirror our own repressed work ethic. The friend's selfishness may reflect aspects of ourselves we've overcorrected. Practical tools for anger alchemy combine ancient wisdom with modern therapeutic techniques. The Stoic practice of prosoke, mindful attention to first movements of anger, helps intercept rage before it hardens into resentment. Somatic experiencing techniques teach us to track anger's physical manifestations: clenched jaw, heated face, tightened fists, and release the energy through controlled movement rather than suppression or explosion. Cognitive reappraisal strategies help reframe anger triggers as information about our values. This angers me because I deeply value fairness, rather than personal attacks. Perhaps most powerfully, ritual expression, writing anger letters to burn, screaming into pillows, or pounding clay, provide symbolic containers for rage that prevent it from leaking into daily interactions. The spiritual dimension of this transformation reveals anger's highest purpose, its ability to shatter illusions and force existential reckoning. Many wisdom traditions speak of holy anger, or white heat rage, that incinerates ego attachments and false compromises. The Kabbalistic concept of din, divine judgment, portrays stern anger as necessary for cosmic balance. Hindu mythology depicts goddess Kali's destructive fury as prerequisite for rebirth. Christian mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote of zealous anger that purifies the soul. These traditions recognize what modern psychology confirms, that certain breakthroughs in consciousness only occur through the catalytic intensity of properly directed anger. The parent who finally confronts their child's bully, the employee who stands up to unethical demands, the abused survivor who rediscovers their voice, all channel anger's fire to burn away fear and reclaim personal power. The completion of anger's alchemical journey arrives not in its disappearance, but in its maturation into what Aristotle termed praeotes, the golden mean between excessive anger and deficient passivity. This state allows instantaneous protective anger when needed, followed by immediate return to equilibrium once the threat passes. Like a well-trained immune system that mounts precise inflammatory responses to pathogens, then promptly resolves, mature anger serves its evolutionary purpose without lingering damage. Those who master this balance describe accessing anger as one might wield a surgeon's scalpel, with precise intention and immediate release, rather than as a blunt weapon swung indiscriminately. Chapter 11. The Forgiveness Feedback Loop: How Letting Go Rewires the Brain for Resilience. The act of forgiveness initiates a profound neurological cascade that reshapes our cognitive architecture in ways most people never anticipate. Each time we consciously release resentment, we aren't just resolving a single conflict but fundamentally altering how our brains will process future hurts. Modern neuroscience reveals that forgiveness operates as a self-reinforcing cycle. The more we practice it, the more our neural pathways adapt to make forgiveness an increasingly accessible default response. This phenomenon, known as experience-dependent neuroplasticity, demonstrates that our brains physically reorganize themselves based on repeated emotional practices, meaning forgiveness is less a moral achievement than a trainable skill that grows stronger with use. The implications are revolutionary. What begins as a difficult conscious choice gradually becomes an automatic orientation toward life's inevitable wounds, transforming our entire relationship with pain, conflict, and human fallibility. At the synaptic level, forgiveness practice strengthens connections between the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational evaluation and emotional regulation, and the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. fMRI studies show that individuals who regularly practice forgiveness exhibit quicker dampening of amygdala activity when recalling past hurts. Their brains have learned to assess emotional threats without becoming hijacked by them. Like seasoned firefighters who respond to alarms with calibrated efficiency rather than panic, the Forgiveness train. Brain develops what researchers call affective modulation, the ability to experience painful emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This explains why people committed to forgiveness work often report feeling less reactive over time. Their neural circuitry has literally been rewired to process slights and betrayals with greater equanimity. The biochemical dimension of this feedback loop proves equally fascinating. Each forgiveness episode reduces cortisol production while boosting oxytocin and serotonin, creating a neurochemical environment increasingly inhospitable to sustained resentment. Psychoneuroimmunologists have tracked how these biochemical shifts accumulate over time, showing that long-term forgiveness practitioners develop what's termed a compassionate physiology, lower baseline blood pressure, reduced inflammatory markers, and enhanced vagal tone, a key measure of nervous system resilience. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle. As forgiveness improves physical well-being, the resulting vitality makes future forgiveness easier by increasing emotional bandwidth. The ancient spiritual intuition that forgiveness brings new life turns out to have concrete biological underpinnings. At the cellular level, letting go quite literally regenerates us. Cognitive scientists identify another crucial mechanism in the forgiveness feedback loop: the gradual reshaping of autobiographical memory. Our brains don't store past events as objective recordings, but as constantly reconstructed narratives shaped by our current emotional state. Regular forgiveness practice alters how we recall painful events, not through suppression or denial, but through what's called memory reconsolidation with updated information. When we consistently bring compassion to our recollections of being wronged, we subtly rewrite the emotional significance of those memories. The facts remain, but their sting diminishes as we layer in new understandings of human frailty, of our own growth since the event, of unexpected gifts that emerge from the wound. The spiritual implications of this feedback loop are profound. Across wisdom traditions, forgiveness has always been framed not as a single heroic act, but as a daily discipline, what Jesus called 70 times 7, and Buddhist teachings term unceasing practice. Modern neuroscience now confirms this ancient intuition. Forgiveness isn't an event, but an ongoing training that fundamentally reshapes how we move through the world. Those who persist discover an astonishing truth, that over time, forgiveness ceases to feel like a sacrifice and becomes instead what theologian Lewis Smedes called the only way to be fair to yourself. The feedback loop completes its revolution when we realize we're no longer forgiving because we should, but because we've tasted the profound liberation that comes from unshackling our hearts from resentment's weight. Chapter 12. The Ripple Effect of Forgiveness. How personal acts of release transform collective consciousness. The decision to forgive never exists in isolation. Like a stone cast into still waters, each act of letting go sends concentric circles of influence radiating outward in ways that subtly reshape the emotional ecosystem of families, workplaces, and communities. Modern systems theory and epigenetics now confirm what ancient wisdom traditions long asserted. Our individual capacity to process resentment affects not just our inner world, but the very relational and even biological fabric of those connected to us. When we forgive, we aren't merely altering our personal narrative, we're changing the vibrational frequency of entire networks of relationships, creating conditions where reconciliation becomes more possible for others. This phenomenon operates on multiple interconnected levels, from the immediacy of face-to-face interactions to the transgenerational transmission of trauma or healing, revealing forgiveness as both intimate psychological work and profound social alchemy. At the interpersonal level, the ripple effect manifests through what psychologists term emotional contagion, the unconscious mimicry and synchronization of effect that occurs in all human interactions. Studies of family systems show that when one member develops greater forgiveness capacity, it creates a softening effect throughout the relational network. For instance, a parent who learns to respond to teenage rebellion with measured understanding rather than reactive anger often finds their child's behavior moderating in turn, not through conscious imitation, but through the subtle shift in the emotional field. Workplace research similarly demonstrates that teams with at least one highly forgiving member exhibit 32% less conflict overall, as that individual's neural regulation capacity literally regulates the group's collective nervous system through mirror neuron activation. These findings validate the Buddhist concept of interbeing, the recognition that no emotional state is truly separate from the web of relationships in which it's embedded. The transgenerational dimension of forgiveness ripples proves even more startling. Cutting-edge epigenetic research reveals that the way we process trauma and resentment doesn't just affect our own biology, but can influence gene expression in future generations. Studies of Holocaust survivors' descendants show that those whose parents found meaningful ways to reconcile with their trauma, without denying its horror, exhibited different stress response gene markers than those whose parents remained embittered. This suggests that forgiveness work may represent a form of psychospiritual DNA repair, breaking cycles of inherited trauma by transforming how ancestral wounds are metabolized and passed on. Family therapists observe this dynamically when a single family member's commitment to forgiveness begins dissolving long-standing patterns of blame and retaliation that have persisted for decades or even centuries. The identified forgiver becomes the circuit breaker in intergenerational transmission of pain. On the societal scale, forgiveness ripples operate through what sociologists call normative spillover, the process by which individual acts of moral courage gradually shift collective expectations about conflict resolution. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa demonstrated this powerfully, where public acts of forgiveness by victims of brutal violence created new social scripts that made reconciliation imaginable for thousands who might otherwise have remained trapped in cycles of retaliation. Neuroscience explains this through the concept of social baseline theory. Our brains are wired to calibrate our emotional responses based on observed group norms. When forgiveness becomes visibly modeled, it literally changes what our nervous systems perceive as possible or appropriate responses to harm. The organizational implications are profound. Schools that implement forgiveness training see measurable reductions in bullying. Corporations that foster forgiveness cultures report higher innovation rates, as employees feel safer taking risks. Hospitals with forgiveness-oriented staff demonstrate better patient outcomes. These effects stem from what's termed psychological safety, the shared belief that mistakes won't be met with perpetual punishment. Forgiveness ripples create environments where the inevitable frictions of human interaction don't escalate into permanent fractures, freeing energy otherwise spent on vigilance and self-protection toward creativity and growth. Quantum physics offers a provocative lens for understanding forgiveness's far-reaching effects. The principle of quantum entanglement, where particles remain connected across distance such that the state of one instantly influences the other, finds an intriguing parallel in the non-local effects of forgiveness. Numerous studies document the letter-writing effect, where individuals who write forgiveness letters, even if unsent, frequently experience unexpected reconciliations or shifts in the forgiven person's behavior. While the mechanisms remain mysterious, these phenomena suggest that forgiveness may operate through what biologist Rupert Sheldrake termed morphic resonance, the idea that patterns of thought and behavior become increasingly accessible to others the more they're practiced. Practical applications of this ripple science are transforming conflict resolution approaches. Restorative justice programs now intentionally include community members unaffected by the original offense, recognizing that witnessing forgiveness processes creates collective healing. Family therapists work with forgiveness ambassadors, relatives who model release of old grudges to soften entrenched family conflicts. Even urban design is being influenced, with cities creating forgiveness gardens, where public art and quiet spaces subtly encourage reflection over retaliation. The most radical implication of forgiveness ripple science is the realization that our personal struggles with resentment aren't truly personal at all. Each time we choose understanding over vengeance, we're participating in what theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the structure of the world's reconciliation, contributing to an invisible but potent field of healing possibility that makes forgiveness slightly more accessible for everyone. In this light, forgiveness becomes not just self-care but social responsibility, not just emotional hygiene but civilizational evolution. Chapter 13. Forgiveness as a Daily Practice. The Micro-Habits of a Liberated Heart. The modern misunderstanding of forgiveness as a dramatic, one-time event obscures its deeper reality as an ongoing discipline, a series of barely perceptible inner gestures that accumulate over time into what can only be described as a transformed way of being. Like physical fitness that depends more on daily movement than occasional marathons, or financial health built through small, consistent investments rather than lottery wins, sustainable forgiveness emerges from micro-practices woven seamlessly into ordinary life. These rituals train the psyche in much the same way muscles develop through repetition, not by sheer force of will, but through the neurological magic of incremental adaptation. Contemporary neuroscience confirms what medieval monks and indigenous healers always knew. The heart learns its habits through daily rehearsal, and forgiveness practiced in small doses becomes the default setting when major betrayals inevitably come. The foundation of daily forgiveness practice lies in what psychologists call micro-moments of release. Brief but intentional pauses to acknowledge and discharge the minor irritations that would otherwise accumulate into resentment. The coworker who interrupts, the driver who cuts us off, the family member's careless remark. These daily pinpricks provide perfect training ground for the forgiveness muscle. Research from the University of California's Greater Good Science Center reveals that people who practice a simple 5-5-5 technique, 5 seconds to name the irritation, 5 breaths to feel it physically, 5 seconds to consciously release it, shows significant reductions in baseline resentment levels over time. This practice works not by suppressing natural reactions, but by preventing the amygdala from consolidating fleeting annoyances into lasting grievances, essentially performing emotional housekeeping before the clutter accumulates. Neurologically, these micro-practices strengthen what's termed the forgiveness default network, a cluster of brain regions including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for cognitive reappraisal, and the temporoparietal junction, involved in perspective-taking. fMRI scans demonstrate that people who engage in daily forgiveness exercises show increased gray matter density in these areas over time, meaning they're literally growing the neural hardware for letting go. The implications are profound. Forgiveness isn't a personality trait one either has or lacks, but a learnable skill that physically reshapes the brain through repeated practice, much as London taxi drivers famously develop enlarged hippocampi from navigating the city's maze-like streets. The body plays a crucial role in these daily rituals. Somatic psychologists emphasize that resentment embeds itself physically long before we're consciously aware of it. The clenched jaw during a frustrating meeting, the tightened shoulders when recalling an old wound. Simple practices like body scans, systematically relaxing tense areas while visualizing emotional release, or gestural forgiveness, symbolic releasing motions like unclenching fists or opening palms, leverage the brain-body feedback loop to accelerate emotional processing. Studies at the Mayo Clinic found that patients who coupled cognitive forgiveness work with these somatic techniques healed from relational wounds 40% faster than those using talk therapy alone. Proof that the body must participate in forgiveness for it to take root deeply. Cognitive reframing exercises form another pillar of daily practice. The benefit reflection technique, spending 2 minutes each evening recalling how a daily challenge taught you something valuable, gradually trains the mind to seek growth rather than grievance in difficulties. Similarly, the three-story method encourages viewing conflicts from multiple perspectives, first through your own eyes, then through the other person's, finally through the detached view of a wise observer. This triple framing, practiced consistently, builds what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously without needing to collapse complexity into simplistic blame. Digital tools have adapted these ancient practices for modern life. Apps like Forgiveness Reminder use geofencing to prompt brief letting go exercises, when users return to locations associated with past hurts. Emotion tracking. Wearables vibrate subtly when detecting physiological signs of resentment, increased heart rate variability, skin conductance, creating opportunities for course correction in real time. While these technologies risk trivializing deep emotional work, early studies suggest they can effectively support traditional practices by increasing awareness of forgiveness opportunities that might otherwise pass unnoticed. The spiritual dimension of daily forgiveness practice reveals its deepest purpose, not merely conflict resolution, but the cultivation of what Franciscan priest Richard Rohr calls a second gaze, the ability to see through surface behaviors to the sacred worth beneath. Micro-practices like blessing the offender, silently wishing well-being for someone who irritated you, or gratitude for teachers, viewing difficult people as instructors in disguise, gradually shift perception at the preconscious level. Over time, what began as forced exercises become spontaneous orientations. We find ourselves forgiving almost before the need arises, not through effort but because our very way of seeing has been rewired. The cumulative effect of these daily practices is what psychologist Dan Siegel terms integration, the harmonious functioning of all brain regions that allows for nuanced responses to life's complexities. Integrated individuals still feel anger when wronged, but their practiced neural pathways quickly modulate the response into constructive action rather than sustained resentment. They experience what Buddhist psychology calls strong back, soft front, the combination of clear boundaries with compassionate openness that marks emotional maturity. This hard-won flexibility explains why longtime forgiveness practitioners often describe feeling lighter or more fluid. They've systematically dissolved the psychic scar tissue that makes most people emotionally stiffen with age. Ultimately, daily forgiveness practice is less about others' behavior than about reclaiming sovereignty over our inner world. Each micro-moment of release is a vote against victimhood, a quiet declaration that while we can't control life's inevitable wounds, we refuse to let them define us indefinitely. The miracle is how these small, daily choices compound, like interest in some spiritual bank account, until one day we realize we've become people who don't just practice forgiveness, but embody it as our natural state of being. Chapter 14. Forgiveness in the Digital Age. Navigating resentment in a world of screens and algorithms. The digital revolution has fundamentally altered the neurobiology of human conflict. Where past generations had the natural cooling-off periods imposed by physical distance and slower communication, we now live in an ecosystem specifically engineered to amplify outrage, cement grievances, and make forgiveness exponentially more difficult. Social media platforms thrive on engagement metrics that reward moral indignation. Text messages strip away tone and context to maximize misinterpretation. Algorithmic feeds reinforce victim narratives by serving increasingly extreme content. This technological landscape has reshaped forgiveness from an organic human process into a radical countercultural act, one that requires us to consciously override the very design of our communication tools. Neuroscience reveals that digital conflicts activate the brain's threat detection systems more intensely than in-person disputes, while offering fewer of the physiological cues, facial expressions, vocal tones, mirror neuron activation, that normally facilitate reconciliation. The result is what psychologists term digitally sustained resentment, a new phenomenon where conflicts that might have naturally faded instead become permanently preserved and frequently revisited through saved messages, screenshots, and social media posts. The architecture of digital communication systematically undermines the three pillars necessary for healthy forgiveness: nuance, temporality, and repair. Nuance evaporates when complex human emotions are reduced to text on screens, stripping away the paralinguistic cues that convey remorse, hesitation, or vulnerability. The temporal dimension collapses when arguments unfold across time zones at inconsistent speeds. A conflict initiated by late-night text may fester for hours before receiving a daylight response, with both parties left in extended states of anxious rumination. Repair mechanisms break down when block, buttons replace face-to-face reconciliation, offering the illusion of resolution while actually preventing the nervous system from completing the conflict cycle through nonverbal reconnection. Studies at Stanford's Social Media Lab demonstrate that digital conflicts take 3 to 5 times longer to resolve than in-person disputes, not because the issues are more serious, but because the medium itself disrupts natural forgiveness pathways. The phenomenon of context collapse on social media adds another layer of complexity to digital forgiveness. When conflicts play out publicly online, the presence of an audience fundamentally changes their emotional calculus. What might have been a private misunderstanding becomes performative, with both parties feeling pressure to maintain their positions lest backing down be seen as weakness. This theater of resentment is amplified by likes and comments that function as social reinforcement, creating dopamine-driven feedback loops where holding grudges actually receives biochemical rewards. The brain's reward centers light up when our outrage is validated by others, making forgiveness feel not just emotionally difficult but chemically unrewarding. A neurological reality that platform algorithms exploit by serving us increasingly polarized content. Chapter 15. The Future of Forgiveness. How technology will transform the ancient art of letting go. As we stand at the precipice of a technological revolution that will fundamentally reshape human consciousness, forgiveness, that most ancient of spiritual arts, faces both existential threats and unimaginable possibilities. Artificial intelligence algorithms already mediate our conflicts. Virtual reality environments allow us to re-experience traumatic memories with new perspectives, and neurofeedback devices promise to rewire resentment at the synaptic level. This emerging technological landscape threatens to outsource our moral development to machines, while simultaneously offering tools for emotional healing that would have seemed like science fiction just a generation ago. The central question of our coming era may not be whether machines can learn to forgive. They're already being taught. But whether humanity will retain its hard-won wisdom about letting go as we merge ever deeper with our digital creations. The future of forgiveness hangs in this delicate balance between technological augmentation and spiritual preservation. Neuroscience is pioneering interventions that target forgiveness at the biological level. Experimental protocols using transcranial magnetic stimulation (TMS) to temporarily inhibit activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with rigid moral judgments, have shown remarkable success in helping treatment-resistant patients release long-standing resentments. While still controversial, these techniques demonstrate that forgiveness isn't just a philosophical ideal, but a measurable brain state that can be intentionally induced. More subtly, neurofeedback forgiveness training allows individuals to observe their brainwave patterns in real time as they recall past hurts, learning through biofeedback to shift from high beta anger waves to calmer alpha-theta states associated with reconciliation. Early adopters report being able to literally watch their resentment dissolve on EEG monitors, a powerful reinforcement that accelerates the forgiveness process. These technologies raise profound ethical questions. Is forgiveness achieved through technological intervention less authentic than traditional spiritual work? Could governments or corporations someday mandate forgiveness protocols for social stability? Virtual reality, VR, is revolutionizing exposure therapy for unresolved trauma. Specialized clinics now offer forgiveness immersion experiences, where patients revisit painful memories in controlled virtual environments, but with crucial differences. They can pause the action to examine situations from multiple angles, digitally, step into their offender's perspective, or even reprogram outcomes to experience symbolic resolution. A groundbreaking Stanford study had participants confront virtual representations of those who'd wronged them, programmed to display remorse that their real-life counterparts never expressed. 70% reported significant reduction in resentment, not because they believed the virtual apology was real, but because the experience disrupted their neural pathways of victimization. As VR technology advances to incorporate haptic feedback and olfactory cues, these simulations will become increasingly indistinguishable from reality, forcing us to reconsider fundamental questions. If virtual forgiveness produces real emotional healing, does the distinction matter? Could we someday achieve closure with deceased or absent individuals through AI reconstructions? Artificial intelligence is already mediating human conflicts in ways that subtly reshape forgiveness dynamics. Chatbots trained on thousands of successful reconciliations now guide couples through structured forgiveness dialogues, using natural language processing to detect unproductive communication patterns in real time. More controversially, predictive algorithms attempt to calculate optimal forgiveness timelines, analyzing speech patterns, biometric data, and interaction histories to determine when someone is psychologically ready to let go of resentment. These tools show particular promise in organizational settings, where AI, emotional auditors, track workplace communications for signs of festering conflicts and suggest targeted interventions before resentment solidify. However, the rise of emotion recognition technology also threatens to commodify forgiveness, reducing it to data points and probabilities that may overlook the ineffable human elements at its core. There's a dangerous temptation to outsource our moral reasoning to machines that can process variables faster than human judgment. But can an algorithm ever truly understand the sacred complexity of a wounded heart? The transhumanist frontier presents the most radical possibilities for forgiveness's future. As brain-computer interfaces like Neuralink advance, we may eventually be able to edit emotional memories directly, diminishing the visceral pain of past hurts while preserving their lessons. CRISPR gene editing technology is already identifying genetic markers associated with vengefulness versus forgiveness, raising the possibility of preemptive biological interventions. These developments force us to confront existential questions. Would editing our capacity for resentment enhance our humanity or diminish it? Is the struggle to forgive an essential part of our moral development that shouldn't be technologically bypassed? The ancient Greek concept of catharsis suggests that working through pain has value beyond its resolution, a wisdom that risks being lost in our rush toward technological fixes. Perhaps the most profound impact of emerging technologies may be their ability to help us visualize forgiveness's ripple effects across time and space. Systemic constellation simulations powered by quantum computing could someday model how releasing a single resentment might alter family patterns generations into the future. Social network analysis algorithms already demonstrate how one person's forgiveness practice can measurably reduce conflict throughout their entire community by shifting group dynamics. As these tools become more sophisticated, they may provide the motivational bridge between intellectual understanding of forgiveness's benefits and the visceral commitment to do its difficult work, allowing us to literally see how our letting go creates waves of healing far beyond our immediate awareness. The spiritual challenge of this technological future will be maintaining forgiveness's soul even as we augment its practice with unprecedented tools. All great wisdom traditions agree that true forgiveness requires facing our pain, not bypassing it, meaning technologies are only helpful insofar as they deepen rather than shortcut this confrontation. The monasteries of the future may need to be neurotech sanctuaries, where people use cutting-edge tools not to escape their humanity, but to more fully inhabit it. The test will be whether we can wield these powerful technologies without losing the hard-earned wisdom that some growth must come the slow way, through the messy, non-linear, profoundly human work of wrestling with our wounds until they become wellsprings of compassion rather than bitterness. As we hurtle toward this brave new world of technologically assisted forgiveness, one truth remains unchanged from ancient times. Letting go will always be both a science and an art, a neural process and a sacred mystery. The tools may evolve, but the essential choice still belongs to the human heart, whether to cling to what was or open to what might be. In this sense, the future of forgiveness looks remarkably like its past, our eternal struggle to transcend the prisons of resentment and claim the freedom that has always been our birthright. Epilogue. The journey through these chapters reveals forgiveness not as a single grand gesture, but as a lifelong practice of returning, again and again, to our essential wholeness. May your own path of letting go be guided by both ancient wisdom and modern understanding, And may you discover what all true forgivers eventually find, that in releasing others, we were always freeing ourselves. The work continues.